The thing to keep in mind as you watch this video is how the focus on financial incentives affect our capacity to function as human beings. Here we have two quotes from from research funded by two major economic institutions, giving us some insight into the fact that a focus on incentives, or using incentives as a means to motivate a person, actually diminishes their capacity for cognitive problem-solving skills, even at the most basic level. And beyond that, we've looked at how the belief in having power over others and the acquisition of money literally change the way that your physiology expresses itself. So you have that picture right there of a caricature of the vagal tone. And when you show a person of lower class images of someone suffering, their vagal tone lights up, showing that they're having an empathetic response. Now, when you show that same image of suffering to a moneyed individual, their vagal tone doesn't light up at all. They literally have a deficit in empathy brought about by status, power, and money. We've also shown how it affects your prefrontal cortex. Anytime that you take on the belief that you have power over others, or that you have power because you have money, or just the focus on money in and of itself, it lobotomizes your prefrontal cortex and it causes you to look like someone who has acquired sociopathy. So the focus on money diminishes our capacity for empathy and to optimize ourselves biologically, and diminishes our capacity for problem-solving skills. So keep this in mind as you're watching this video, as we go through the history of money and kind of the things that are being done with money in the modern era. Realize that these people are afflicted. This is an affliction that is rampant in our society. And what's going on is they're not realizing that they have that the focus on money is creating an empathy deficit in our society and in people in general.
Never gonna kill
Over time, what happened was money took over not as a means, but as a measure of wealth. And slowly it started to displace the real wealth creating capacity of people. And it also started to displace the real wealth creating capacity of nature, because those are the two places where actual things are produced.
What is money? Money is it's a thing that basically can buy you happiness in this world.
It helps to get the things that we need from day to day to survive.
Other than the root of all evil, money is an incredibly handy thing to have that, I don't know. I have no idea.
Money has existed in many forms, from shells to tobacco to gold. Any object becomes money simply when we agree to use that object for the purpose of money. In other words, money is an agreement within a community to use something as a medium of exchange.
The community could be local, could be a city, could be a country, could be the world. And anything has been used historically almost as a medium of exchange.
Over time, money has become more ethereal and abstract in form. In 1971, money was delinked from physical substance altogether when President Nixon took the US dollar off the gold standard. Today's money has reached the height of godlikeness, existing in the form of binary digits and flowing through computers at optic speeds.
We call that fiat money. It's money by decree. There's nothing intrinsically valuable in it. It's just that we all accept it in payment for goods and services. Another way of looking at it, it's a claim on a certain amount of purchasing power somewhere. And we've all agreed to honor that claim. If we cease to honor the claim, then it will cease to be of any value to us. Of course, that's true of any money. But gold or tobacco has intrinsic value, and so consequently, even if you decide you're not going to honor my payment in tobacco, I can still go smoke it or sell it for something. That has intrinsic value. Our current money supply has no intrinsic value whatsoever. It's just purely agreed upon social institution.
Put simply, our money today is faith-based. How does that work?
When I was little, I thought, well, the government makes money, and then I go and I work, and then I get some of that stuff and I use it to go buy my Barbie doll or whatever. You know, I just had a very simple idea. But we have released to the banking system, to private corporations, the power to issue money.
The noted economist John Kenneth Galbraith, in one of his books, said, "The way in which money is created is so simple that the mind is repelled."
Money flows into the economy through the central bank. In the United States, that's the Federal Reserve, or the Fed, a private banking corporation. The Fed creates new money out of thin air by simply writing a check to purchase U.S. government debt. The Fed has no bank deposits on which that check is drawn. Private banks then multiply this new money through a process known as fractional reserve banking. The banks only have to keep 10% of their deposits on reserve, and the rest they can lend out, thereby expanding the original amount. Let's look at a simple example. Say you earn $100 and put it into your bank. The bank keeps $10 in its reserve account and then loans out $90 at interest to another customer. That customer deposits the $90 into the bank. The bank keeps 10% in reserves and loans the rest out at interest. This continues until the original $100 deposit expands to $1,000. The important thing to remember is that all money comes into existence as debt. Now that we've explored the changing nature and influence of money over time, let's connect the dots on where we are today. Our current money system developed over a period of roughly 500 years and made the industrial age possible. But we live in a very different world than the early days of modern banking and money. Is the economic crisis a siren song urging us to rethink our system and culture of money?
When you have a system by which you're creating money as debt when a bank issues a loan, you get into some very pernicious dynamics. Because when the bank issues a loan, it issues only the principal of the loan, the amount of money that corresponds to the principal of the loan. It does not create the money that must be repaid as interest.
Let's say you borrow $100,000 from the bank at 10% interest. A year later, you must repay the bank $110,000. And remember, the bank did not create that extra $10,000.
Now, where's that other $10,000 going to come from? The only way money gets created is by banks making loans. So the bank had to make a loan to someone else to bring that additional $10,000 into the economy.
So each year, more new money must be loaned into existence to cover all of the past outstanding debt. And that debt compounds at the rate of interest.
Since compound interest is an exponential function and money is created on the basis of loans that carry compound interest, you have an exponential growth in debt.
If it's a debt-based, interest-based system, you put out 10, you take back 11. You put out 11, you take back 12 and a half. So it grows and grows and grows. It's a pyramid scheme until eventually the whole world is locked in debt. That's why we have all this pressure on growth, growth, growth. We have to always expand just to find the money to service the debt that is our money supply. Just to stay where we are, we have to grow, grow, grow.
If the economy's not growing fast enough to increase the debt fast enough, then the loans go into default just because, you know, people are scrambling around to get the money to pay back the bank.
It's like a game of musical chairs. Everybody knows that game. We all played it as kids. If you don't have enough chairs, then somebody's going to lose out. That's the way it is with the debt money system.
Will somebody default? Yes, there is always defaults because that's what the nature of business is. That's the nature of capitalism. We're taking risks. Is that bad? No, not necessarily. We live with risk.
This risk we call the business cycle, which goes something like this. In boom times, debt accumulates exponentially, like plaque building up in the veins of the economy. Since people are competing for a scarce amount of money, inevitably someone defaults. These initial defaults trigger more defaults, and the cascade of defaults eventually crash the economy. The crash wipes out bad debts and people's savings, but with the bad debt cleared, the economy's circulatory system begins flowing upward again.
So it is a system that has boom and bust cycles built right into it.
There had been 187 monetary crises over the last 25 years. There have been 96 banking crashes in the last 25 years. The system is systemically unstable.
The reason the whole system's collapsing is that the whole world has been locked in debt. Every government's in debt, people everywhere are in debt. How could they all be in debt? Who are they in debt to? They're in debt to the bankers who created this whole system and are taking back more than they put out.
Something's wrong with the design, and the design is terminal, in my opinion, because we cannot grow debt to infinity.
Money was taken to another level of privilege when the entire modern economy was created on the basis of GDP and gross national product.
Following the Great Depression and World War II, we created what is known as gross domestic product, or GDP for short. GDP refers to the dollar amount of goods and services produced nationally. Today, we look to GDP like a thermometer to measure the well-being of our societies.
What we get into as we're just pursuing the growth in GDP is the faster we take useful resources out of the environment, run them through the economy, and dispose of them as toxic waste into our air, water, and soils, we count that as progress, irrespective of whether that economic activity did anything to actually improve the value of people's lives.
Simple example is a train wreck. Train wreck is good for growth. First of all, the undertakers get some work, but also then you're going to have to build new train cars and new railroad tracks and so forth and so on. That's literally how we measure growth now.
I think that the crisis today stems from the fact that there's almost nothing left to convert into the realm of goods and services. Anytime something gets converted into goods and services, the GDP grows, the economy grows. How long can this last? How many more fish can we convert into a catch, and how many more forests can we convert into board feet, and how many more relationships can we convert into services? There's almost nothing left.
We still haven't connected the dots between interest rates and climate change. We haven't recognized that in a debt-based economy, we have interest rates that are created. That means that there are loans that need to be paid back. In order to pay those loans back, then people produce too much and people consume too much.
Our whole environmental crisis is a consequence of an economy in which, in the aggregate as a species, we are consuming faster than the environment can regenerate.
Our entire economic system, fueled by the financial system, despite all of its great achievements, and I'm a capitalist and I'm a believer in free markets, this is the system that I believe in, but it has some very, very fundamental systemic inconsistencies with the reality that we live on a finite biosphere. Whether it's climate change or the water crisis or the soil crisis, all of these crises are symptoms of essentially us breaking through the safe boundaries. And that puts into question the whole premise of our ever-expanding system. And it's not capitalism versus socialism. Communism was an expansive system. So this isn't about politics. This is about physics.
Say we have a planet, and we can either liquidate planet Earth right now for $60 trillion for maybe 10 years, so $600 trillion. Or we could live on Earth in perpetuity for maybe, $5 trillion a year. Economically, the rational choice would be to liquidate it. I mean, it's absurd. You think we would never do that, but as a matter of fact, we are doing that. It's not a conscious decision, but that's the sum total of the logic of interest.
So we live in a system that's growing at a compound rate on a finite planet. I mean, are you guys all freaked out about that? Seriously, do you sit around thinking about where this is going, or does that seem like a problem for the next generation? Anybody freaked out? No one looks freaked out. You're freaked out.
In my last year of college, a friend and I started a media search engine, and it was the height of the first tech bubble. So in 6 months of work, we were able to sell the company for 7 figures. And that's way more money than any 23-year-old should ever have. A lot of it was denominated in stock options, and so it was still virtual wealth, but that was enough for us to catch the greed bug. The very first manifestations were on the material level, trying to buy all of these useless things on eBay that I didn't need. The first things that I started buying were swords, kind of a symbol of conquest, but also pretty useless. I actually caught myself being ridiculously greedy when I was truly considering buying a jetpack on eBay. This is very similar to the jetpack that I was looking to buy. You can see the 2 tanks on the back of the fuel. You get about 60 seconds of thrust for $8,000 of fuel, and the actual pack itself cost $15,000. There was absolutely no research involved in like figuring out how to get the best deal on the jetpack. It was just like, whoa, that's a jetpack. That is so cool. I want to buy one. It was kind of like a sugar high. You know, you feel a lot of intensity and energy, and it lasts just a very short time, but then you quickly have a crash afterwards and a feeling of emptiness. And part of the crash was that though we had sold the company for a lot of money, a lot of virtual money, I was aware that there were other companies that had sold for a lot more. So even the ridiculous amount of wealth that we got wasn't enough.
Money is not neutral. It's not value neutral. All currencies support the behaviors that people express around its use. Our currency in particular have a quality of design in it, meaning that it has to be scarce in order to be valuable.
What we've done is we've created scarcity. The money system creates artificial scarcity where there need be none. For example, there's nothing more abundant on earth than water. When I was a kid, you never paid for water. Water was abundant. Water has been made scarce by many things, but by one thing, its association with money. Anything that gets associated with money is scarce because money is, as we know it today, is fundamentally scarce.
This is Economics 101. Scarcity of resources, individual insatiable appetites. That's a fearful belief. That's extremely frightening. Versus understanding that I'm related to you, and what happens to you is going to affect what happens to me.
I know there's places where there is not enough. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the lie of scarcity that is an unconscious, unexamined system of beliefs that's even before thinking. We look through a lens of scarcity at the world. So we immediately think there's not enough to go around everywhere we look.
So once something is scarce, you would see the tendency of people competing. Now, the idea is scarce. It's an idea of scarcity. It's not really scarce because it's man-made. More can be made available.
When we think of scarcity and when we think we don't have enough, we begin to hoard.
We have a world full of people who love to accumulate and claim their value or claim their prowess based on how much they've accumulated. Most financial institutions are all about how much they can accumulate.
Put it in banks, put it in stock, have huge amounts of it, let it keep building and building upon itself. When I was a kid, if somebody could say he was a millionaire, that was amazing. Now it's almost meaningless. You know? It's like, you got to be a billionaire or more. And it's become this goal in and of itself. There's a sickness there. It's an addiction. And it also means that it drives people to do everything they possibly can to exploit everybody else just to get more money. It has also encouraged sociopaths. I think it's created sociopaths.
Actually, the accumulation is extremely unhealthy. It's like having a blood clot, in a way. I mean, we die when that kind of circulation is stopped.
Money will make us a little bit more happy, particularly if you're very poor.
There's a certain amount of money that will move you from poverty to having what Erich Fromm called a pleasant sufficiency of means. What we might think of as just as a middle-class lifestyle where your adequate basic needs are cared for. But beyond that, it doesn't seem to buy much happiness.
If we can just insulate ourselves for just a moment from this barrage of messages that comes down upon us in our culture, we all know, as our deeper and better selves, we all know that a person's real worth has nothing to do with his or her net worth. But our default position is money.
To say capitalism is evil, I think, is naive because it's taken many different forms. It's a chameleon. Some of them have been relatively successful, others have not. The form we have today is what I call predatory. And I think it's a mutant virus. It's spreading like wildfire across the world.
I've always referred to it as a global casino. And that's exactly what it is. And it really began to gather speed when President Ronald Reagan in this country and Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister in Britain, in the 1980s, they started deregulating everything.
Both Reagan and Thatcher were advised and greatly influenced by economist Milton Friedman. Friedman was the leader of the Chicago School of Economics and a loud champion of what is known as free market capitalism.
There's three principles. One is that the only goal of business, the only responsibility of business is to maximize profits, regardless of social and environmental costs. Two, businesses shouldn't be regulated, or regulation should be minimized because regulations get in the way of making profits. And three, everything should be run by private business.
The doctrine of free market economics believes that markets behave rationally and efficiently because the people that make up the markets act rationally to maximize their self-interests. In other words, markets are inherently self-regulating and spread prosperity best without government interference. This so-called rational market theory took its cue from the Enlightenment era's scientific paradigm, which reduced humans to rational separate parts, operating in a purely mechanistic universe. The 1980s brought in a new economic paradigm. Reaganomics was the popular name for the economic policies of President Reagan, which included widespread tax cuts and deregulation of domestic markets. Otherwise known as trickle-down economics, the theory assumed that benefits given to the wealthy trickle down to the needy.
The Federal Reserve, in the presence of bubbling inflation that was scary and prices rising out of control, took a hard turn to the right. And by that I mean, in the 1980s, it shifted its emphasis in favor of capital, that is finance, banking, and away from labor, and by labor I mean working people in general, wages, the robust economy that allows wages to rise and spread prosperity more broadly.
These changes in regulation and policy transformed corporate culture to the single mission of maximizing profit. Over the next few decades, corporate monopolies swallowed up small businesses, and manufacturing moved to less industrialized countries, where labor was cheap, natural resources less tapped, and environmental regulations less strict.
I actually am a fan of free enterprise and what I would qualify as true capitalism. What I believe we are experiencing in this country is we actually have an overstory of global corporate interest guiding policy. That's not all bad. We have a global market. A corporation is quite efficient at distributing money and credit and products and services globally. But it's been at a very high cost to local economies.
It's like what we would call in agriculture a very unhealthy monoculture, directed from central banks and from the pinnacles of society, with no real understanding of what's going on the ground.
The Wall Street financial institutions have become, to use a computer analogy, essentially the operating system of the society.
We heard years ago that about trickle-down economics during the Reagan era in the United States. What's actually happened since that idea came into the collective is the opposite. The upper classes, and particularly those who know how to manage this new form of money, actually put thousands of tiny siphons down into the middle and working classes and sucked up most of the wealth. It wasn't trickle down, it was siphon up.
In the past 30 years, the wealth gap in the U.S. has increased steadily. The average income for the bottom 90% hovers at $31,240, while the top 1% now makes an average of $27 million per household.
In our gut, we feel like something's wrong. How come my standard of living is going down generation to generation, while the global elite is garnering money that is incomprehensible? People who have net worths of tens of billions of dollars. And yet the guy on the street, actual quality of life and wealth accumulation is becoming ever more difficult.
You can call it many words: a plutocracy, a kleptocracy, a corporatocracy, a cannibalocracy.
I was working particularly in a slum near Gandhi Ashram, and I'd met a guy in the slum who was better than me in every possible way. And he was smarter than me, he was harder working than me, he was even more compassionate than me. And the only way that I was better than him was that in a single year, I would make more money than he could make in 5 lifetimes. And that was incomprehensible to me. Here was this person who, by all of the metrics of the world, and even metrics that the world doesn't appreciate, like compassion, he exceeded me. And yet in this one dimension that we try and funnel every interaction and transaction through, which is through the lens of money, he would never be able to reach my level.
Investment dates back to the origins of money and has served very beneficial functions in supporting healthy flows of wealth. But the investment banking world lost its mooring in the real economy and morphed into a global casino with disastrous consequence.
If you look at the amount of money in the world, there's no shortage of money, but most of the money being made and exchanged in the world is money making money off of money and derivatives and arbitrage. I think maybe the estimate is 5% of the money exchanges that go on in the world have anything to do with goods, services, or capital equipment and building capital capacity.
I got to a point in my junior year where I had done the networking and I connected with people at the banks down in New York, and I became in their social circuit, and I got to really get to know these people and see the lifestyle beyond the office. My 2 good friends who were in these banks that were working, not on rare occasions, 90-hour work weeks, and then partying like crazy to get some kind of release from that kind of stressful environment, and it was just not what I wanted to be a part of. The idea that I had attached myself to of going to a bank, working for the market and being able to make that kind of significant paycheck and income that would allow me to free myself from the financial burdens of not only just taking on the debt to go to university, but to really have the financial resources to do the things that I was passionate about. And in the process of attaching myself to that goal, I got so removed from the things I was actually passionate about to begin with.
The finance sector, otherwise known as Wall Street, doubled in size over the last 14 years. Without us noticing, this massive growth in the finance sector decoupled it from the real economy. For example, in 2008, the value of all goods and services produced globally totaled $70 trillion. while the value of all financial assets in the world peaked at $194 trillion.
So we're starting to see this financial sector take over our economy. The financial sector is not economically productive. It means it doesn't make widgets, it doesn't make cars. It's a paper shuffling aspect within our economy now that is beginning to dwarf all else. I would say it's planet finance now is getting bigger than planet Earth.
An efficient financial system is like an electric utility, and it should be really run like a public utility. And any financial system that is using up more than 10% of a country's GDP is inherently out of control and kind of metastasizing and becoming a cancer on the real economy.
What the economy is doing is literally turning the living wealth of people, community, and nature into financial wealth, which is nothing but a fiction to begin with. So this becomes essentially an act of theft of the real resources of the rest of the world. And that is this distinction between phantom wealth, which is pure money, unrelated to the creation of anything of real value, versus real wealth, which, if properly understood, the most valuable forms of real wealth are those things that are totally beyond price, which are, love, a healthy, happy child, a strong family, a caring community, or a healthy natural environment.
I get tired of saying that defense is to be made an excuse for wasting dollars. I don't believe we should pay 1 cent for defense more than we have to.
I seriously question an increase in the Pentagon budget in the face of the department's recent Inspector General's report. How can we seriously consider a $50 billion increase in the defense budget when DOD's own auditors say the department cannot account for $2.3 trillion in transactions in 1 year alone?
It is, I was going to say terrifying. It is such a monumental task. I have met with 2 former officials of the Pentagon who served in the budget and controller and those areas. And I've mused over the fact that I've read some of these things and asked what they thought.
We process nearly 10 million paychecks a month. 10 million times to get things screwed up. I've had my pay screwed up 6 times since I've been in the department. And it's really bad when you screw up your boss's pay.
I doubt, to be honest, that people inside the department are going to be capable of sorting this out. I have a feeling it's going to take some folks from outside to come in and look at this and put in place a process that over a period, and I regret to say, but I've seen how long things take. I think it's going to take a period of years to sort it out. And I think it'll probably take the cooperation of the Congress to try to get the system so that you can actually manage the financial aspects of that institution rather than simply report on things that have happened imperfectly.
There's more oversight over the Head Start program than there is over the entire military budget.
It's a terrible record, and it's preposterous that the Defense Department doesn't know what's happened to this money.
This situation's a disgrace. It tells me that we can't meet our constitutional obligations to the taxpayers of our country to make sure that things are honestly and legally spent.
We were told major cuts in education programs, and then we read, well, $500 million is paid per year that isn't owed.
It is an incredible thing that we arm the world and then turn around and come to Congress and say, look at all these weapons out there. They're almost superior to ours. They're comparable to ours. Well, of course they are. They're ours. We sold them to them.
Since the end of the Cold War, we've sold more military weapons than the rest of the world combined.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists, and will persist.
My name is Jack Shanahan, Vice Admiral, U.S. Navy, retired. One of our nuclear bombs blows up Hiroshima 15 times over. 5 devastates Russia. After that, this is how many the U.S. has left. I feel safe reducing nuclear weapons. Do you?
Particularly the Secretary of State, James Burns, understood that the bomb was more a diplomatic tool than a military tool. The chief of staff of the U.S. Army and the combined chiefs, General Marshall, said this is not a military decision. It has nothing to do with the military. It's maybe a diplomatic, political, other kind of decision, but it's not a military decision. So, interestingly, the military, I mentioned this, I think, in our last discussion, virtually all the major American military leaders went public after the war, saying the atomic bomb was totally unnecessary. Some called it barbaric. The president's chief of staff went public. Can you imagine the chief of staff saying, and he was a good friend of the president, said, this is barbarism. I wasn't taught to kill children and women. So that's very clear.
Pentagon, the day before 9/11, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld declared war, not on foreign terrorists.
The adversary is closer to home. It's the Pentagon bureaucracy.
He said money wasted by the military poses a serious threat.
In fact, it could be said that it's a matter of life and death.
Rumsfeld promised change, but the next day, the world changed. And in the rush to fund the war on terrorism, the war on waste seems to have been forgotten.
My 03 budget calls for more than $48 billion in new defense spending.
More money for the Pentagon when its own auditors admit the military cannot account for 25% of what it already spends.
According to some estimates, we cannot track $2.3 trillion in transactions.
$2.3 trillion with a T. That's $8,000 for every man, woman, and child in America. To understand how the Pentagon can lose track of trillions, consider the case of one military accountant who tried to find out what happened to a mere $300 million.
We know it's gone, but we don't know what they spent it on.
Jim Minery, a former Marine turned whistleblower, is risking his job by speaking out for the first time about the millions he noticed were missing from one defense agency's balance sheets. Minery tried to follow the money trail, even crisscrossing the country looking for records.
The director looked at me and he says, "Why do you care about this stuff?" It took me aback, you know. My supervisor asked me why I care about doing a good job. So.
He was reassigned and says officials then covered up the problem by just writing it off.
They got to cover it up. That's where the corruption comes in. They've got to cover up the fact that they can't do the job.
The Pentagon's Inspector General partially substantiated several of Minery's allegations, but could not prove officials tried to manipulate the financial statements. 20 years ago, Pentagon employee Franklin C. Spinney made headlines exposing what he calls the accounting games. He's still there, and although he does not speak for the Pentagon, he believes the problem has gotten worse.
Those numbers are pie in the sky. The books are cooked routinely year after year after year.
Retired Vice Admiral Jack Shanahan commanded the Navy's Second Fleet the first time Donald Rumsfeld served as Defense Secretary.
With good financial oversight, we could find $48 billion in loose change in that building without having to hit the taxpayers.
In the 2.5 minutes since this report began, the Pentagon has spent nearly $2 million, and it may never know where 25% of those tax dollars went. In Los Angeles, I'm Vince Gonzalez for Eye on America.
This is like the worst thing I could possibly think of right now, being hungover, and they're gonna make it smell like rotting flesh.
Burnt hair, oily machinery, dead body.
we have an apple pie, but we don't have it on premises.
Is there ever a worry that sort of baddies would come and use the area as training? You know, you have Israel, Lebanon, Egypt, Syria, all as neighbors, and you know, you just wonder, you know, who gets to come train, you know?
Well, I mean, Jordan's in a tough neighborhood. There's no doubt about it.
Jordan is in a tough neighborhood. In fact, both Egypt and Syria are currently trying to put down popular rebellions, and Iraq is basically in a full-on special ops civil war. where are they getting all these weapons? Sofex. How hard is it to come and buy arms on the open market?
For states, it's easy.
Easy.
For terrorist organization or criminal organization, it's more difficult. But for example, in America, the main supplier of drugs cartel in Mexico are the free market in America.
Sure.
So,
and we noticed that they sell kits. For example, you can buy a regular helicopter, but you can buy a kit to upgrade it to add in a missile system or a Gatling gun system quite easily.
Yes, of course. It's what we call now dual technology. For example, Iran bought this kind of plane officially for commercial operation. But Russians say, we don't sell weapons to Iran, we sell Antonov. It's a commercial plane.
So I can buy a helicopter from one country, and I can buy a weapon system from another country, and then have an attack helicopter.
Yes. For example, this kind of helicopter, the North Korea have some of this kind.
So the North Korea's bought some of these?
Yes. So it's pretty scary.
Can I have a keychain? Thank you. Where are you guys from? Kazakhstan. Czech Republic. Is that made in Azerbaijan? Yeah. So Azerbaijan makes the biggest, longest rifle I've ever seen. Where are you guys from? Germany. Germany. Turkey is here. China's here. Jordan is here. The Russians are here. All selling weapon systems to whoever wants to buy them. You want jets, you want rockets, helicopter grenades, Robocop killer systems. You have 20 seconds to comply. You got it. That's an automatic grenade launcher.
That's my favorite weapon in the entire Marine Corps arsenal.
No one's stopping him. No one's saying, hey, you shouldn't be actually playing with the grenade launcher. Now, fucking around with these dudes and their guns was fun, but after a while you start to freak out because you realize that they're selling weapons the same way that you'd sell next year's car model.
The world's most demanding shooters demand SIG. This is the world's most revolutionary pistol. We have the resources and the energy to solve any small arms problem.
Javelin would be one of the most innovative weapon systems.
I'll tell you, it is a hugely successful in Iraq and Afghanistan, not just in the United States forces, but internationally.
Now, when he says successful, what he really means is that it's great at destroying stuff. And we weren't the only ones to notice. Like the Marine we ran into, who had just finished his second tour in Iraq.
Yeah, it's weird, man. It's like everybody's like real cordial with each other, but like at the end of the day, we're like buying weapons to destroy each other.
That's it.
I don't want to sound too like liberal or anything.
No.
It's really not glamorous.
Yeah,
people.
Exactly.
It's like they don't discriminate. They'll sell to anybody who has fucking money.
And the biggest sellers by far are the American companies. In fact, 16 of the 20 largest arms manufacturers are based in the United States. And being the biggest store in the mall means selling a lot of weapons to a lot of people. What's crazy about this is that America gives a lot of these countries foreign aid so that they can come here and buy weapon systems from their companies. It's kind of like a parent giving their kids a credit card and saying, go to the mall that I own and just buy whatever you want. So the last time you were in the Middle East, you were in Iraq as a Marine. Does it spin you out to see like Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics, you know, like all these American companies making tons of money off of war?
You know, what's the trip is you see Norenko right here, next to an American arms display, and they used to launch 9-foot Norenko rockets on us.
Really?
Yeah.
The insurgents would buy Norenko rockets and then use them against you, and they're right next to the American military companies. Interesting. So we went over to the Norenko booth to see if they could explain how their weapons ended up in the hands of Iraqi insurgents. All right. Ni hao.
Hey, ni hao.
Hi, how are you?
Yes, where are you from?
From America, Vice. BBS, news.
Oh, news.
News.
I'm sorry, maybe I'm not good.
Oh, okay. Okay, thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Ni hao. I must have bad BO. They're all walking away very rapidly. Ni hao. Everyone just left. While we couldn't get an answer from the Chinese, sitting right there on display in the next booth over were shells that were exactly the same as the ones Iraqi insurgents used to make roadside bombs, or IEDs.
They take the tips off of these, and you can see it's pretty hollow in there, and they'll pack this whole thing full of C4, and just it creates some hellacious shrapnel.
And here you can just buy it like you would a chocolate bar.
Exactly.
The Carlyle Group is a global alternative asset management group. In a nutshell, they buy and sell companies using private investors' money. The story of the Carlyle Group is the story of a new kind of capitalism emerging in America. We'll start the story with this guy, Frank Carlucci. He had served in a variety of government positions, but from 1987 to 1989, he was serving as the United States Secretary of Defense for Ronald Reagan. He changed the rules on procurement at the Pentagon so that companies would be put on long-term supply contracts. He also had to cooperate with Operation 111 Wind, an investigation looking into corruption at the Pentagon with officials being bribed to secure large defense contracts. 6 days after he finished his term as Defense Secretary, he went straight to the Carlyle Group, and he advised Carlyle to take a look at a company called BDM. They had been hit hard by Operation Wind, and their share price had plummeted. Eventually, Carlyle acquired BDM for $130 million. It was a steal, because it turned out that BDM were on a long-term contract with the Pentagon. Is it possible that a person like Frank Carlucci might have known which companies were on long-term contracts and which were not? Who knows, but the Carlyle Group sold BDM in 1997 for $975 million. After Frank Carlucci came the appointment of James Baker. He had worked in politics for 18 years. He'd led presidential campaigns for President Ford, Reagan, and Bush. He'd served as Chief of Staff, as Secretary of the Treasury, and eventually as Secretary of State under George Herbert Walker Bush. He was and is a big deal.
People know me. I'm kind of a big deal.
But it wasn't going to just be former White House staff joining the ranks at Carlyle. Before long, the former president himself, George Bush Sr., would be giving speeches on Carlyle's behalf. He was senior advisor to Carlyle's Asia Investment Board. Neither the Carlyle Group nor the former president have been forthcoming in the way that he was remunerated for his relationship with the Carlyle Group. The former South Korean president, Park Tae-jun, was also now working for Carlyle, and he'd helped them secure nearly $1 billion in Koram Bank. So when George Bush Jr. gave the United States a pretty radical change in policy towards North Korea,
North Korea is a regime arming with missiles and weapons of mass destruction while starving its citizens. States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world by seeking weapons of mass destruction.
It did not go down well in South Korea. It caused a lot of tensions when the new policy provoked North Korea into doing what it does best, issuing threats. And threats and instability are not good for business. It was widely reported at the time that Daddy Bush, still acting in his role of Carlyle's Asia advisor, sent a strongly worded memo to his son through a former ambassador, and he argued that he should continue negotiations with North Korea, and sure enough, by July, the Secretary of State announced that talks with North Korea would resume. Perhaps it was simple fatherly advice. Nevertheless, it showed just how much influence Daddy Bush had over policy in the United States, whilst he worked for a private company profiting from decisions that government made.
Send every available ambulance, everything you got to World Trade Center now.
Before long, the Carlyle Group found themselves at the center of a huge controversy. On September the 11th, 2001, Carlyle were holding their annual investors' dinner in Washington, D.C. In attendance was James Baker, Frank Carlucci, and George Bush Sr., who left on the morning of the attacks. Also in attendance was a man by the name of Shafiq bin Laden, the half-brother of Osama bin Laden. And it was just 6 days later that George Bush Jr., the current president, would name Osama bin Laden as the prime suspect.
There's an old poster out west, as I recall, that said, "Wanted, dead or alive."
The bin Laden family maintained they had severed all contact with their estranged brother in 1991 when he lost his Saudi citizenship. But the connections between Bush Sr. and the bin Ladens through the Carlyle Group raised a few eyebrows in the United States at the time. Carlyle said that the bin Laden family had invested just $2 million. But other sources said the actual amount was much higher. The Wall Street Journal ran an article suggesting that Bush, Baker, and Carlucci had all met with the bin Laden family at their headquarters in Jeddah on more than one occasion. And that in the ensuing war on terror, the bin Laden family might actually profit from the hunt for their own brother because of their investments in Carlyle. So Carlyle were forced to terminate the relationship between themselves and the bin Laden family, and it was all pretty embarrassing. But they managed their way through the PR catastrophe quite well. Cynthia McKinney, who sat in the House of Representatives at the time, said it is known that President Bush's father, through the Carlyle Group, had at the time of the attacks joint business interests with the bin Laden Construction Company and many defense industry holdings, the stocks of which have soared since September the 11th. It all looked pretty damning on paper. The President of the United States was the son of George Bush Sr., who was involved in the work of the Carlyle Group, which managed investments from the bin Laden family, which looked set to profit from the war which was already being spoken about.
Our war against terror is only beginning.
It wasn't made much better when the president, George Bush Jr., announced a massive increase in defense spending in 2003.
My budget nearly doubles funding for a sustained strategy.
It was made all the more potent by an earmark in the defense budget of $476 million for the development of a mobile howitzer gun called the Crusader, which was manufactured by a company called United Defense, who were owned by, you guessed it, the Carlyle Group. Carlyle's head of communications, Christopher Ullman, would later say it was one of Carlyle's best investments. Defense contractors weren't the only companies increasing their share price in the years following September the 11th. Intelligence agencies were starting to swell too. For more information about that, take a look at our video on the history of NSA wiretapping. It's there. So in 2007, George Bush, as you guys know, would announce Mike McConnell as the Director of National Intelligence from his previous role at Booz Allen Hamilton. 1 year later, right in the middle of his term as Director of National Intelligence, the Carlyle Group made their move to buy Booz Allen Hamilton. In 2008, Mike McConnell headed straight back to his former employer, now a Carlyle Group company. Needless to say, Forbes reported that from their initial $910 million investment, the Carlyle Group made a tidy $2 billion in realized and unrealized profits from the Booz Allen Hamilton deal. It's probably worth noting at this point that Mike McConnell had served as head of the National Security Agency from 1992 to 1996, and he was nominated to that position by George Bush Sr. So when you begin to investigate this kind of access capitalism, as it was called at the time, it does raise quite a few interesting questions and a whole range of paths that you might take to further an investigation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Inspector Coleman, you were the Inspector General for the Federal Reserve, right? Okay.
That's correct.
Have you done any investigations concerning the Federal Reserve's role in deciding not to save Lehman Brothers, which led to shockwaves that went through the entire financial system?
In that particular area, you know, I don't generally comment on specific investigations, but we do not currently have an investigation in that particular area.
All right. What about the $1 trillion plus in expansion of the Federal Reserve's balance sheet since last September? Have you conducted any investigations regarding that?
Right now we have a, we call it a review, and so I don't know if the term investigation may have different connotations. So we're actually conducting a fairly high-level review of the various lending facilities collectively, which would include, you know, the TALF, a variety of the different programs that are in process. So we're looking at them at a fairly high level to identify risk.
Well, I understand that, but we're talking about events that started unfolding 8 months ago. Have you reached any conclusions about the Fed expanding its balance sheet by over $1 trillion since last September?
We have not yet reached any conclusions.
Do you know who received that money?
For the, we're in the process right now of doing our review, and
Right, but you're the Inspector General. My question to you specifically is, do you know who received that $1 trillion plus that the Fed extended and put on its balance sheet since last September? Do you know the identity of the recipients?
I do not know. We have not looked at that specific area at this particular point on those reviews.
What about Bloomberg's report that there are trillions of dollars in off-balance sheets transactions that the Federal Reserve has entered into since last September? Are you familiar with those off-balance sheet transactions?
You know, I think it may be important at this point, too, just to bring up a certain aspect related to our jurisdiction. And just to clarify perhaps some of my earlier comments. We are the Inspector General for the Board of Governors, and we have direct oversight over board programs and operations, and are also able to look at board-delegated functions to the reserve banks, as well as the board's oversight and supervision of the reserve banks. We do not have jurisdiction to directly go out and audit reserve bank activities specifically. Nevertheless, in our lending facilities project, for example, we are looking at the board's oversight over the program, and to the extent that extends out to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York.
Well, I have a copy of the Inspector General Act here in front of me, and it says, among other things, that it's your responsibility to conduct and supervise audits and investigations relating to the programs and operations of your agency.
That's correct.
So I'm asking you if your agency has, in fact, according to Bloomberg, extended $9 trillion in credit, which, by the way, works out to $30,000 for every single man, woman, and child in this country. I'd like to know, if you're not responsible for investigating that, who is?
We have responsibility for the Federal Reserve's programs and operations, audits, to conduct audits and investigations in that area. In terms of who's responsible for investigating, would you mind repeating the question one more time?
What have you done to investigate the off-balance sheet transactions conducted by the Federal Reserve, which, according to Bloomberg, now total $9 trillion in the last 8 months?
I'll have to look specifically at that Bloomberg article. I'm not, I don't know if I have actually seen that particular one.
That's not the point. The question is, have you done any investigation or auditing of off-balance sheet transactions conducted by the Federal Reserve?
At this point, we're conducting our lending facility project at a fairly high level and have not gotten to a specific level of detail to really be in a position to respond to your question.
Have you conducted any investigation or auditing of the losses that the Federal Reserve has experienced on its lending since last September?
We're still in the process of conducting that review. Until we actually, you know, go out and gather the information, I'm not in a position to really respond to the specific question.
So are you telling me that nobody at the Federal Reserve is keeping track on a regular basis of the losses that it incurs on what is now a $2 trillion portfolio?
I don't know if you're telling me that you're mentioning that there's losses. I'm just saying that we're not, until we actually look at the program and have the information, we are not in a position to say whether there are losses or to respond in any other way to that particular.
Mr. Chairman, my time is up, but I have to tell you honestly, I am shocked to find out that nobody at the Federal Reserve, including the Inspector General, is keeping track of this.
Congressional fundraising, which is much less covered but no less astonishing. In the 2014 election cycle, candidates for the House and Senate raised a combined $1.7 billion. That's a lot of money. That's more than it cost to buy 230 million tubes of hemorrhoidal cooling gel, and it's somehow even more upsetting. Now, interestingly, much of that money has to be raised one way or another by the politicians themselves, which they have complained about for years and say that it can be the worst part of their job.
You know, I hated raising money. Hated it.
It's painful, frankly, to continually ask people for money.
If Don and I could tell you how many hours we spend with our good colleagues on our side of the issues talking about raising money, it would be an embarrassment, because it is an embarrassment.
The amount of time politicians spend fundraising is not just embarrassing, it's horrifying. Some say the members can spend anywhere from 25 to 50% of their time on it. But former Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle once guessed that in the 2 years before an election, senators can spend 2/3 of their time raising money. And if 2/3 of the work you do is strictly about the money, you're not a legislator, you're Robert De Niro at that point. But amazingly, all of this is glamorous compared to the hours and hours that politicians spent fundraising over the phone. A few years ago, a PowerPoint presentation from the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee to freshman lawmakers leaked, and it was showing their model schedule, which suggested 4 hours a day of call time. 4 hours on the phone. The only time that makes sense is if you're trying to have phone sex with Sting. Have you come yet? It's been 3 hours. Have you come yet? I've got stuff to do, Gordon. This can't be my day. And look, horrendously, lawmakers have even been pulled out of hearings to go do that call time.
The first week I was down here, we were having a committee hearing in education, and my chief of staff at that time came in and said, you have to leave. You know, we went into the ante room, and I said, where do I have to go? And she goes, you have to go make phone calls. And I looked at her, and I'm going, this is my first hearing, and you're coming in and asking me to leave? How am I going to learn anything?
Exactly. She was a rookie legislator. She needed to learn how to do her job. The Knicks don't pull rookie Kristaps Porzingis out of a game so he can go make cold calls to season ticket holders, because that would not be the best use of Kristaps Porzingis' time. And if you think that sounds like a dehumanizing process, rest assured, it is.
I felt used when I had to go raise money. I was embarrassed. I thought it was ugly. I thought it was demeaning. My staff kept saying, you got to go do it. I said, I don't like it. You get a Rolodex, and you get to go outside the building for a whole day and dial numbers of jerks you've never heard of in your whole life to get money out of them.
He's absolutely right. If you want to get money out of a bunch of jerks you've never heard of before, you shouldn't have to call them on the phone when you can simply open a vape shop. Boom. Done. Done. And the problem is, members are still expected to pay dues to their own party, which can then be distributed to candidates in tougher races. BuzzFeed actually got its hands on a DCCC spreadsheet 2 years ago showing the amount of money the committee expects each member to pay, with figures ranging from $125,000 at the low end all the way up to $800,000 at the top. And if you are desperately trying to rack up dollars, that can affect the kind of people that you are targeting on the phone, as Senator Chris Murphy explains.
For a Senate race, I'm not calling anybody who doesn't have the chance of giving me at least $1,000. So you got to imagine that the people I'm calling, you know, are folks that are, you know, making $500,000 to $1 million, and you know, they have fundamentally different problems than everybody else.
And that is a huge problem, because it cannot help but affect the way you see the world if you're only calling donors rich enough that their main concerns are estate taxes or which Belgian kimono their cats will wear that day.